Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to Hosanna Fellowship. Tonight, we're going to continue in our study through the book of Genesis. And tonight, also, is the end of Hanukkah. So, Shag Hanukkah Sameach. Happy Hanukkah to any of our Jewish friends and acquaintances, relatives that are practicing Jews. And for the rest of us, let us also commemorate the holiday, because this is one that Jesus actually celebrated. It tells us in the 10th chapter of John, the Gospel of John, that it was winter and he went to the feast of the dedication, which actually was the feast of the rededication, as it commemorates the rededication of the temple after Antiochus Epiphanes had desecrated it. When the Maccabean revolt was able to throw off that yoke of oppression from the Greeks. And that lasted for a couple of hundred years or so until the Romans came in. But at any rate, it is a big celebration in Israel and for the Jewish people. Week-long celebration. And it was indeed a miracle. A miracle in that they only had enough oil to keep the lamp lit for one day. But God stretched that oil for them, so they were able to keep it going for all 8 days. But now the feast is over. Time to pull out the candles and clean up the menorah and put it away for next year. So, again, Shag Hanukkah Sameach. Okay, so here we are. We're in Genesis chapter 30. And tonight we're going to see that the wives compete against each other. We saw how Jacob had gone to Haran, and in Haran he gets a lesson in treachery as Laban switches daughters on him on the wedding night. So he gets up in the morning, and instead of the one he had worked for 7 years to pay off her dowry, the one he expected to see, her lovely face that he'd fallen in love with and everything, and lo and behold, he wakes up in the morning and, this isn't her. It's Leah. Oy vey, what now? So Laban gives him a special deal. He says, okay, you worked 7 years for one daughter, I'll let you work another 7 years, and you can have the second daughter as well. It's strange in cultures, that practice multiple marriages. Some, you could have all the wives you want as long as they're not related. But in the Navajo culture, my understanding is that, at least until recently, the custom was that you could have all the wives you wanted as long as they were sisters. Either way, it goes against God's standard. God set a standard in the Garden of Eden when he brought Eve to Adam and performed the first marriage. He set that standard, one man, one wife for life. And because we as human beings are able to mess up just about anything, of course marriage has been messed up many times over the ages. It was still before the flood, when one of Cain's sons decided, you know what, I want to have 2 wives. And there were problems in the household. And we see that as we go through the scriptures, that any time you have more than one wife, multiple wives, there's trouble in the household. So we can kind of understand where Jacob is right now and how he was hoodwinked into serving another 7 years And now all of a sudden he has 2 wives. And as we left off our study last week, we saw that he had not only the 2 wives, but he had 2 wives and 4 sons. 4 sons already. Reuben, Simon, Levi, and Judah. And that's where the chapter ended. But now we see that jealousy, tonight we're going to see that jealousy develops between the wives, and they compete for Jacob's love. So let's go before the Lord. Father, we thank you for all you're doing in our lives. We thank you for this ministry that you put on our hearts, and pray, Lord, that you would bless the ministry and that you would bless the lessons that go forth such that they would touch hearts, minds, and spirits, that they would help your people, the remnant that you are calling to yourself, to be drawn closer to you, to understand you a little better, and to love you a little more. We want to raise little Martin Sosa to you, Lord, as we did this morning. This little one who Adrian Dominguez asked us to form a prayer chain for. Lord, we just pray that you would bring your loving, healing touch upon this little one. And Adrian didn't give us any details. We don't even know where he is. We only know that he is gravely ill in a hospital. But we know, Lord, that you are sovereign and you are able to unite our hearts in prayer over the entire world, really. That you are not bound by time and space. And if we lift our prayer to you, Lord, from any corner of this earth that you've put us on, and what corners? You made it round so there are none. But from any point on this globe, Lord, you can hear us in heaven and reach down to accomplish your will. And may it be your will, Lord, as we look to pray in accordance with the way we should, that we would look to the matters that you place on our heart and raise them to you, Lord, such that we can have a confidence that we are raising to you the things that you want to accomplish already. Glorify yourself, dear Lord, through what you bring about in this ministry, and glorify yourself through bringing little Martin back to a healthy existence, that he may be a joy to his parents, Lord, in Jesus' name. Verse 1. This is chapter 30, Genesis chapter 30, verse 1. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Even though he loves her tremendously, this is the one he wanted to marry in the first place. And we're going to see through his life that she's the one he always loved. Loved her more than Leah or any of the other women that come into his life, as we're going to see how they come into his life tonight. Loved her more. And yet, this demand that she puts on him is a little out of bounds. Now, Leah is a fertile woman. We saw she's already given him 4 sons. But Rachel is barren. So Rachel becomes jealous of Leah. And she makes an unreasonable demand of Jacob. "Give me children." And Jacob reacts with anger. It's like, what can I do? I've been doing my part. You know, it works with Leah. I don't know why God has withheld children from you, but I've been doing my part. And so he gets upset with her. It says that he actually got angry with her. And we need to be understanding of the feelings, desires of those around us, especially our spouses. In that culture, a woman was supposed to bear children. It was a reproach for a woman to not be able to bear children. So Rachel is upset because she can't do job one. And she sees that Leah is able to bear children. This is her sister. And she's very upset. She's devastated that she isn't able to do what her sister is doing. She isn't able to bring children into the world. And in that culture, that's how they measured the worth of a woman, how many children she had. And this has been pretty true throughout the ages, even into this past century, the one that ended 18 years ago. My grandmother had 9 children. One of her daughters, my Aunt Berlinda, had 10. And it wasn't uncommon for women to have that many children. And this century before, even more so, they had children until they wound up dying in childbirth on the 10th one or something. And it goes back for quite some time. My ancestor, Jose Manuel Romo de Vera, had 2 wives in his lifetime. We don't know if they were simultaneous or one after the other. It would seem that he was doing things right and it was one after the other. But between the 2 wives, he fathered 22 children. Of course, only one of those children lived, as the death rate was always so high, the child death rate. And until we got a little bit more knowledgeable of how to do the prenatal care and how to keep the children safe and everything and avoid some of these terrible diseases, the child death rate was very high. And also the rate of women dying in childbirth was pretty high. But in centuries past, that is how a woman's worth was actually measured, how many children she could have. So Rachel is very disappointed and even upset that she's not able to bear any children. Verse 3. So she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." Then she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged my case, and he has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. So Rachel came up with a solution. So solution is the same sounding word to contention. There's the contention between the wives. Oops. And we see that Rachel now comes up with a solution to take care of that contention, to come out on top. Her solution was to give her slave girl to Jacob as a concubine, so that she could act as a surrogate. And this is the same mistake that Abraham and Sarah made when they decided they were going to help God out. And the result of Sarah giving Hagar to Abraham as a concubine in order to serve as a surrogate was that Ishmael was born. And we've talked about Ishmael, how problems that we see today have their roots in him. Because the Islamists of today claim to be the descendants of Ishmael. And they established a replacement theology saying that God is no longer happy with the Jews because they failed him. So now he's turned to the other son, meaning Ishmael. But we also saw, the scriptures told us, they described Ishmael as a wild ass of a man, whose hand was against everybody, and everybody's hand was against him. And we see that there's always war in the world of Islam. If they can't find somebody else to fight, they fight themselves. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, they say, in order to talk about the common cause, so that when it comes to going against Israel, even the Shiites and the Sunnis will come together on that one. But once they get beyond that hatred for Israel, the next greatest hate is between the Shiites and the Sunnis. Going back to the time of the fourth Imam, and this isn't really the time for that history lesson again. But we see that when we try to help God out by applying human wisdom, lo and behold, the results are usually disastrous. Now it seems that there's less rebellion in Bilhah than there was in Hagar. She's okay with what's going on. And she knows her place as a slave. She doesn't get a vote. Slaves never get a vote. And she is evidently resigned to her position and does as she's told. Because of her being given as a concubine, used as a surrogate, 2 sons result. And just as with the previous sons, they indicate, their names indicate what the people are feeling and thinking. Remember the first ones: Reuben, behold a son; Simeon, God has heard; Levi, bonded. So God has bonded us together was the thought. And Judah means praise. So after having 4 sons, Leah thought, oh my goodness, my husband is going to love me now and stay with me, and so I'm going to praise because of that. But that wasn't the case after all. He still loved Rachel more than Leah. So now we have 2 others, and their names indicate what Rachel was thinking. The first one, Dan, God has judged. And the second one, Naphtali, which means wrestling. So their names are indicating what they had in their hearts. Verse 9. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. And Leah's maid, Zilpah, bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, a troop comes. So she called his name Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. So she called his name Asher. Again, the names indicate what they felt. A troop cometh. She's got 4 sons, and now she's added a 5th that she's considering her son, because it was her maid that acted as the surrogate, being Jacob's concubine. So this one counts as one of hers, sort of. So Leah counters Rachel's by giving Jacob another concubine, as we see this competition develop between the wives. 2 more sons result. So now Jacob has 2 wives, 2 concubines, and 8 sons. Again, those names are indicating their thinking and their feeling. Gad, a troop, and Asher is happiness. Verse 14. Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" And Rachel said, "Therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." And he lay with her that night. So here we see a compensation. Compensation on the part of Rachel for the mandrakes. And so she's paying Leah for her son's mandrakes. And the compensation is that Jacob is to sleep with Leah that night. Now we see that the boys are growing. Reuben is probably in his teens by now, and he probably is tending sheep by now, because that was very common in those cultures, that when a boy got to be 12, 13 years old, at the time that they were bar mitzvah in the Jewish culture, bar is son and mitzvah is covenant, so bar mitzvah is when they become a son of the covenant. When they take their vows to become a member of Jewish society, a member of their synagogue. So he's at that point, and usually the son of a shepherd, when he turns 12 and is getting ready to be bar mitzvah, he's given his first flock, just a couple of sheep to tend. And as he grows, he'll be given more responsibility, or since that is his flock, he's trying to raise it up and make it a huge flock. So by now, Reuben is probably tending sheep, and he's going out, working in the field some. It's the time of the harvest, and he finds mandrakes out in the field. Now, mandrakes are kind of an interesting thing. It's this plant, and you can see that the root of this thing looks kind of like a man with the two legs, sort of that shape. And it was considered to be something that would cause fertility, to help in fertility for a woman. So this is why Rachel wanted this. She's hoping that this will cause her to be more fertile. And herbs have been used for both trying to become more fertile and also trying to limit fertility, as they've tried over the ages to limit or increase how many children they're able to have. Pennyroyal is an herb that women have used in the past in order to cause a miscarriage. Sort of a natural plan B, if you would. It's not as effective as some think, but it can indeed cause a miscarriage. So some women have tried to limit the number of children they have by using these things throughout the ages. Now, of course, they can have the manufactured drugs that will cause all that. But the mandrake was in order to increase fertility and even to act kind of as an aphrodisiac. So Rachel wants to have children. And the animosity between the women is evident. The way that Leah answered her. "It's not enough that you've taken my husband, you want to take my son's mandrakes too?" So, anyhow, Leah trades her son for a night with her husband. Trades her some mandrakes in order to be able to sleep with her husband. So, it's almost like paying somebody for physical relations. Verse 17. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, God has given me my wages because I have given my maid to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. And then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterward she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. So there's more conception involved here. Leah bears 2 more sons and a daughter. The names of the boys are still indicate what they think and feel. Issachar, this is payment, a recompense, and Zebulun, to dwell together. Now, the daughter is named Dinah, which means controversy over rights. So, we'll see how that comes into play in a few more chapters when Jacob and his family go back into the land of Canaan. But Dinah is mentioned because she is going to resurface. The scriptures, well, ancient writings in general, don't mention women all that much unless they are really noteworthy and they are going to come into play in some way. So Leah thinks that now that she has given him 6 sons, Jacob will make her number 1 wife. But as we've already mentioned, Jacob always loved Rachel more than anyone else. So even though she's given him 6 sons, he says, what more do you want from me? When are you going to love me? And nonetheless, as we mentioned in our last meeting, having children isn't necessarily the best way to try to strengthen a relationship. We see couples that have their problems in the home, their marriage is strained, they're even starting to think about divorce, and then the woman will say, you know what, if I have a baby, maybe then he'll love me and stay with me. And they have the baby, and lo and behold, it doesn't help matters at all. In fact, it strains the situation even more. The man can even get resentful about her having had the child, and more often than not, those relationships break up. And we see here that it doesn't matter how many children you produce, it isn't going to change a man's primary love, a person's primary love. She's produced 6 sons and a daughter, at least 7 children that she's given him. And still, his love, his number 1 love, is Rachel. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So here's a revitalization for Rachel. She finally has a son. As I said right at the beginning of the lesson, that in that culture for a woman not to have children was a reproach. It was like a curse, like being cursed. But now she finally has a son. And she has this revitalization, this joy that comes over her. And this is Jacob's 11th son. So now he has 11 sons and at least one daughter. So, 2 wives, 2 concubines, 11 sons, and at least one daughter. He's building up quite a family. And it came to pass, verse 25, that when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away, that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go. For you know my service which I have done for you." And Laban said to him, "Please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake." Then he said, "Name me your wages, and I will give it." So here's an aspiration on Jacob's part. He wants to go back to his homeland, back to the land where his father is, where his mother is, where his brother is. It's been at least 14 years now. He worked 7 years for each of his wives, 7 for one and 7 for the other. That adds up to 14. And he figures that by now Esau's anger is probably appeased, and he could go back and have a living in the land that where he was born, the land that he loved. There's something about where a person is born, how it calls to him. I was born in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and I love it there. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. It's a little bit cold for my poor old bones now, but the land is beautiful. It means the meadows, and that's what you have, is beautiful cattle country with these rolling meadows. Las Vegas Grandes. La Encomienda de Las Vegas Grandes was the name of the land grant, the original land grant there that Las Vegas, New Mexico is a part of. And the problem with northern New Mexico is there is no industry. It's very difficult to find a way to make a living in northern New Mexico. That's why my father came to Albuquerque when I was 4 years old, 4.5 years old. There was no work in Vegas. But still, your homeland has a draw. Seems like every time I've tried to leave, New Mexico has brought me back. And there's some places that I really loved, but somehow the land of entrapment always drags me back. I really loved it down in Florida. It was great. I loved going and fishing on the Gulf. And the weather was very nice. I actually saw it snow there one time. The snow got about to the level of the hood of the car and melted. It never hit the ground. But it was always pretty warm. Air conditioning was the thing there. And like I say, I really loved it. I loved a lot of things about it. But family wasn't there. We were alone, just me and my first 2 sons. And the culture was totally different. So when things made it difficult to stay in Florida, where do we go? Home. So, of course, it's not the only place I've been that I've even come to like, but somehow home always calls you back. And so Jacob has that desire to return. And of course, for a Jew, Israel has a tremendous call on their lives. Every time at Passover, that's the next big feast for the Jewish people, Pesach, celebrated with the Seder, and then the week of unleavened bread, and just all the different customs that go about. But every year, at the end of the meal, the Jewish family will say, next year in Jerusalem. It's their desire to celebrate the Passover, where they were called to in the Old Testament, when the Passover was established. God told them to celebrate it in the place where He would place His name. And this was supposed to be a call upon the Jewish people forever. So they do desire to be there in the homeland. Desire to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. But at this point, the Passover has not yet been established. In fact, Jacob hasn't even had all of the 12 patriarchs yet. Only 11 so far. But he has developed quite a family. So there's the 2 wives, 2 concubines, 11 sons, that's 15 people, at least 1 daughter, that's 16 people in himself, 17 people in his family. When he left Canaan, Beersheba, he was alone. Now he's grown 17 strong in his family. And he hasn't at this point acquired much in the way of material goods. He's been tending Laban's flocks. And Laban realizes that he has been blessed because God is blessing Jacob. It's for Jacob's sake that the flocks have flourished under his care. But they still belong to Laban. Now Laban, thinking on material terms, says, you know what? I really don't care why it's happening, but my flocks are growing as long as he's tending them. So he wants to keep Jacob working for him because of the prosperity that's coming his way as the flocks are just flourishing under his care. Now we know, and the scriptures tell us, that it's because God was blessing Jacob. And it's a good place for Laban, it's a good place to be for a boss, to be between a believer, one who loves God and who is serving the Lord with all his heart, to be between them and God. Then you know what? As the blessings flow, the one that's between the believer and God is blessed. This concept goes on throughout the scriptures, like when Joseph is down in Egypt, which we will see in a few chapters. He's sold into slavery to the house of Potiphar, and Potiphar sees that God is blessing him, leaves him in charge of the household, because, why not? As God is blessing him, Potiphar is in between them, and he's just, receiving all these blessings. And everywhere that Joseph goes, he winds up in a prison. And lo and behold, the prison guard, the captain of the guard there, sees that everything he touches prospers. So he puts him in charge of all the other prisoners. Why not? Now he's between Joseph, the one God loves and is blessing, and God, lo and behold, everything is working right for him. And this even goes on to the full nation when Pharaoh is the one that's between Joseph, who he named Zaphanath Paneah, bend the knee before. So when Pharaoh, and in fact all of Egypt, is between Joseph and God, they flourish as a result of God blessing Joseph. So any bosses out there that hear me, it's not a bad thing to hire godly people that love God, because God loves them back tremendously, and as he blesses them, guess what? You're going to flourish too. Of course, it's better if you happen to be given to the Lord yourself. And the blessings are going to be even greater still. But Laban, we're never told that he ever considered the Lord. And in fact, in a couple of chapters, we're going to see that he was keeping household gods, little g gods, little idols. So he sees that he's being blessed just because Jacob is there. Verse 29. So Jacob said to him, "You know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. And now, what shall I also provide for my own house?" So he said, "What shall I give you?" The he here is Laban, who said, "What shall I give you?" He's asking, what do you want in the way of wages? But Jacob recounts his credentials. You see what's been happening. Since I've been tending your flocks, they've flourished, they've grown. You've got a lot more now than what you had when I came. And it's a cultural difference. Remember, when he got there, everybody was hanging around, leaving the sheep near the well, leaving them there thirsty in high daytime, instead of watering them and taking them to eat a little more grass and ruminate a little bit. They would wait around with the sheep thirsty until everybody got together so they could move the rock. Well, Jacob understood how to care for the sheep a little bit better. He knew, okay, if I take them by the stream and let them have a little water, even if it's from the well, however I do it, if I let them have their water while it's still a high day and let them feed, they're going to get healthier. And they're going to be stronger. They're going to flourish. So Jacob had a better understanding of how to raise sheep than the people up in Haran. But of course, the biggest reason that he had all these blessings, the biggest reason the flocks were flourishing is because God chose to bless Jacob. So Laban asks him what he wants in order to keep working for him. And Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come. When the subject of my wages comes before you, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the lambs, will be considered stolen if it is with me." So the remuneration for his labor is established. Jacob asks for a flock as his wages. And he's saying, you're not going to give me anything. I'm going to earn my keep. You're going to pay me for my labor, and this is what I want as the payment for my labor, for what I have earned. And what I want is a flock. And he chooses the less value of the sheep. See, the white sheep were regarded as more valuable. The brown weren't regarded in the same way as the white sheep. The wool of the white sheep was easier to dye and prepare for use in making clothing. With the brown sheep, you were more limited in how you could color the wool, how you could dye it, and you probably would have to bleach it out first before it would take a dye in the first place. So the white sheep were more valuable. At least they were more appraised higher than the brown sheep, or any other color for that matter. Although when we get to Laodicea, that we see in the book of the Revelation, they raised black sheep, and the wool was very highly regarded. That black wool that they raised in that area, and that black wool, you didn't have to dye it if you wanted to wear black. So they wouldn't dye it. You couldn't even dye it. There was black, and how you gonna put more color into that? It just wouldn't take it. Verse 34. And Laban said, "Oh, that it were according to your word." So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hand of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. So now there's the obligation. Laban accepts the terms, and now he's obliged to pay the wages. They separate the flocks. Jacob's sons are tending what are now the family's livestock. And Jacob continues tending Jacob's livestock, his flock. Verse 37. Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips of them, and exposed the white which was in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters in the watering troughs, where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the streaked, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. But he put his own flocks by themselves, and did not put them with Laban's flock. So he's keeping the flocks separated. And there is a bit of deception on Jacob's part here. Jacob understands animal husbandry. And he puts measures in place to have the flocks produce colored sheep. And there could have been somewhat superstitious about the different branches that he was setting up in the watering troughs. But they also had an effect. It wasn't so much that they had the different stripes and streaks and all, but by putting them there, the ewes would have to come and go in between those rods, those sticks that were pointing up, and they weren't as mobile. So the rams would come and take advantage of the situation and impregnate the ewes as they were there at the watering troughs. Now the brown is a more common gene, a more common color. And so the white, that's more of a recessive gene that's less common. So the white were going to be fewer to begin with. And Jacob understood these things. And here we're going to see where what he knows about animal husbandry is going to really come into play. And it came to pass whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous, and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. So here's where his knowledge of animal husbandry really comes in. And the streaks and everything, well, some superstition involved in this probably. But the fact that they would contain the ewes and make it easier for the rams to mate with them, and the fact that the darker colors, the brown, was more prevalent than the white, which is again why the white was valued. You know, the rarer something is, the more valued it is. It's like a diamond. What gives a diamond its value? The fact that it's rare. You know, it's more valuable than sand because sand is everywhere. You go to the beach, you can dig up tons of sand with no problem. But diamonds, it takes a lot of labor to dig them out. They're very rare, the natural diamonds at least. And so because they're rare, they have a much higher value than a shovel full of sand. So when the stronger sheep were coming in is when Jacob would set up those rods. Make sure that it was the stronger rams that would come to service the ewes. And the weaker, when it was Laban's flock, he didn't bother to put these measures in place. So his flock is increasing and strengthening, flourishing, while Laban's stock begins to dwindle. Jacob's measures work. His flocks are strong and increasing, and Laban's flocks begin to dwindle. So we see this proliferation of Jacob's flocks. So, thank you, Lord, for your word and the lessons that you have for us in your word. Help us, Lord, to receive from you as we look to your word, to understand how you tell us about people the way they were in your word. And sometimes we see that some of the people in the scriptures are less than forthright. And yet, knowing that you use people sometimes despite themselves, it should give us hope that if you could use them, you could use us as well. We see that Jacob is being deceptive. We see that he's done some things that are a little bit questionable. But because of your will to have him be the leader of your chosen people, the progenitor, in fact, of the line that would bring Messiah, you tolerated a lot, almost as much as you do with each of us, Lord, for we all fail miserably. We thank you that even when we fail, you make the means that we might be reconciled to you, and you can use us just the same despite ourselves. Help us, Lord, to have hearts that are stayed on you, that we might fail less, and you, Lord, would be glorified more. as you work through us. In Jesus' name, amen.